This is Becoming Inclusive from the Kaleidoscope Group, where we're thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion for more empowered people at work. We're committed to real change, and that begins with real conversations. Welcome in.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Becoming Inclusive. This is one of your hosts, Kat Potts, your favorite host, I'm sure, but I'm also here with our other host, Reggie Ponder. How are you, Reggie?
I am doing well, and I take exception to that favorite host thing. But okay, I'm happy to be here, and I'm always happy when we have this next person as our guest.
Yes. So everyone, you've seen her on our podcast many times, and we're really glad to have her back on with us. Hanlie van Wyk, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for graciously accepting me back again.
Always. And she is a DEI global practitioner and engagement leader at the Kaleidoscope Group. Mm-hmm. And today we're going to be talking about influencing change and stakeholder buy-in and alignment. We've talked a lot before with Hanlie about just generally getting everyone holistically at the company at a place where everyone's kind of ready to change, right? Adopt the new culture that a company is trying to acquire. But sometimes it's hard to even from the top down get the key stakeholders kind of in that alignment around what do we want change to look like before we can even start talking about how to expect others to embrace it. So I really want to ask you, Hanlie, is what are your thoughts around the top-down influence and when you're at a place with clients potentially where at this key stakeholder stage, it's kind of a challenge to sort of get them aligned on what is ideal change look like at our company?
Kat, I would say that when it comes to influencing change, everyone is 100% responsible. So it doesn't matter which one of the stakeholders you are. You may be responsible in different ways, but everyone has a role to play. And so it's really important that leadership sets the tone for that, to guide the organization in the direction it's going, and then everyone else can follow and influence each other towards that change.
Hanlie, the whole issue of change, though, when we talk about everyone's responsible for it, there is that's such a big word, change. And so just the direction of where you go, if everyone's responsible for it, that becomes kind of tough because everyone probably has a different idea of what change should look like and how we should change. Am I...
Well, I mean, I would hope that having engaged with the Kaleidoscope Group, hopefully, or having engaged with anyone else, that conversation is had right up front, like but the business case, the why for that change in the DEI space. And that might be that you think that it's good for business, which it is and it can be. But it could also just be that it is about the culture. So the employees, a case for the employees, it's a place that they work and you want them to be engaged and happy. Or it could be that you feel that it's just the human case. It's the right thing to do. So whichever it is that you decide to take, whichever approach you decide to take, should be clearly articulated, shared, and come from leadership in the ideal world, before we even start to see how each of the stakeholders will then play a role in that.
So as an employee, Hanlie, as employees, there's some employees who are saying, we need you to change, and they're trying to affect change from the bottom up. And then there are the C-suite folks who are saying, yeah, we need to change, but not exactly how you think we need to change. And so there's really not that alignment. And I know a number of companies, especially as it relates to DE&I, are at odds there, where the C-suite thinks they should go and where the employees think they should go. Any thoughts?
And really quick, I just want to piggyback on that. You made me think about not only may there be difference at levels within the company, but then also at the stakeholder level, the areas, the areas that they want to prioritize changing.
Mm-hmm. And that is why that central why is so clear, and that the plan and the strategy that's then developed off the back of that must make sense to all of the stakeholders so that they can understand exactly where they fit in, what the expectations are of them, and how they can act on that plan so that it becomes real. And if there is a disconnect, Reggie, as you mentioned, between leadership and employees, it's going to be difficult, because if it is something that's super important to employees and they might manage and facilitate their own change within the realm that they move, right? So it could be an ERG, it could be a council, all of those things are possible, but the change may not be as sweeping or as deep as you need it, unless you have critical mass. And when you have critical mass, you have revolution.
Or is impactful, because this is gonna just get off just a little bit, because I know we want to get back to the leaders, but when you speak about this whole thing about ERGs or BRGs, is that you can form that group can work to try to impact change, but if it's not valued by the company, there's only so much that can really get done there, and they become closer to a social group than a effective group.
Absolutely. And that's when leadership becomes intentionally or unintentionally a barrier to change. And if you remember in some of the other talks we spoke about, there has to be competence in the system. People have to be confident about what they're doing. They have to have the right motivators, and they have to be able to overcome barriers. And so as we're trying to minimize barriers, we hope that leadership will not be one of them.
And so when you talk about leaders, you have this thing. I love it because you do the alliteration. You have define, declare, and demonstrate. Talk to me about those three.
Yeah, so it is important for leaders to go through 3 steps, exactly as you said: define, declare, and demonstrate. So the first is to define the why, the business value of it, but also the personal value of it, because it is impossible for someone to be passionate about something, right, if they don't have a personal connection to it. It could be intellectual and they decide they want to do it for the business case, that's fine, but there's much more energy that comes from someone who has their personalized business case around it. Then they have to define the success, like what does success look like and how do we measure that? That's really, really important. And it's critical to business. It's not something that we can step over, right? Then they have to declare that commitment, to say, this is what we as an organization are committing ourselves to. This is what we are going to be doing. And here's who's accountable. Here's who we are going to involve in this on a personal and an organizational level. Then they have to communicate that message out with regular consistency. Effective communication is absolutely key. So that's another piece that they would then have to work on when they're in the declare phase. And then the demonstrate phase is absolutely critical as well, because if they cannot model inclusion, so if they don't have the competence and the confidence and the right motivation, right, to model that inclusion and model the behaviors, it's going to be very difficult for people to take them seriously or to follow them, because people will look at what you do more than what you say. And it's then that they can deliver the results, right? And provide resources and direction and help with goals and objectives and help all those different stakeholders move in the direction of that success that has been defined and accepted amongst the leadership team.
You know, you both have been on here enough times with me to know that sometimes my brain likes to go a little rogue. And so I'm currently on a little bit of a different planet, but I just have a question I have to get out, is around, is there any situations where you have to work through biases within the leadership team in order to get to that alignment that they may not be aware of? Because they could all come to the table, they may even all come to the table really aligned, right? But then from your vantage point as a subject matter expert, be like, actually, you all have a bunch of biases here. I don't know if this is really the change that you want. What does that look like?
Absolutely. And that's often the things that we find out when we are starting to deliver some of the training, because, we have these 5 conscious competency inclusion models and we work through those. And often through that, not only do we learn more about the group that we're dealing with as we're facilitating, they learn more about themselves and themselves as a group. And so there's many of these aha moments that go off during that time. And that's often when people will come and say, oh, you know what? I never realized this about myself. Is there something that we can do on a personal level? How can I grow my competency as a leader? This is important to me, and I need to show up as an empathetic leader. How do I go about that? And then you have an opportunity to move people in that direction. But as you know, you cannot work with people who are fully resistant to wanting to that change. But I always say resistance is just feedback.
Ooh,
So
I like
what
that.
What are they resisting? What is happening for that person? How do we include them in the conversation so that they can discover for themselves where the resistance is coming from, or share it? And often it's fear. So it's just to create opportunities of psychological safety where people can feel that they can ask those questions and have those conversations. And we shouldn't exclude them just because they're resisting.
And so I want to probe a little bit there, Hanlie, when you talk about it's fear. Is it fear of doing the wrong thing? Is it fear that it's the change is going to impact me negatively? Where do you see that fear being dimensionalized?
I think it's definitely what you've mentioned. So there could be fear that I don't really know how to do this. This is new to me. And I haven't spent the time to educate myself or to go through training or to learn at my own pace. And so I might look bad. So that does happen. Or I might look stupid. And that's not something a leader wants to necessarily show, right? So that could be one. The other one can just be that it's against some value that they have, that they feel is not a good match for some of the DEI conversations that might be going on. And so that will require a conversation to see if that is in fact true or not. And then sometimes it's just that people are afraid that with change coming, something is going to change fundamentally for them in their place of work, and they might be negatively impacted. And so they'll be looking out for themselves, not necessarily in a negative way, but be concerned about the fact that this is going to bring about change, and it's not change that I necessarily even want in my life because I'm retiring next year, or whatever it may be. I'm looking for a promotion, and I don't know how to navigate this. So it could be a mixture of things.
Wow, I really appreciate that, Hanlie, because I see sometimes when we talk about DE&I, we talk about it, or some people look at it as a zero-sum game. Is that as other people are included, as other people get equity, as we start to expand diversity, that means that it has to mean that that's going to be a negative impact on the other people.
Yep. And you make a great point, and I do think that is one of the generators of that fear, right? Because we think exclusively, right? We think black and white, if you like. We think this or that, but we need to move from that into a thinking of and, because that's what I try to encourage people, even in their language, to use is the and. So what will you gain? What more will this bring? Rather than focusing on what might have to shift or change or disappear, because sometimes things do have to no longer be there. We can't be naive about that. But there's always something that can be gained by being more inclusive, by being more diverse, and certainly by being more equitable.
I also wonder, too, if you have a bunch of individuals that are scared or concerned or have their own personal agenda. I know some of that may come from previous work jobs that they've seen X happen, so Y is going to happen. That kind of baggage that can happen. But I wonder too, and I challenge, if you see that there's a lot of employees that are very resistant, very afraid, maybe that's speaking actually to the business's current culture. Mm-hmm. And you know what I mean? And maybe that can also be used in terms of getting the stakeholders aligned on, like, this is the reality of where your culture is at. Because really, if you feel at a company and you're confident about the company, you feel valued, you feel like there's equity there. Yeah, maybe you're a little resistant to change. Like I said, it could be past experiences. But if your culture is uplifting and all that kind of stuff that people look for, there should be less fear in some cases. And what does that really say about your culture if you have people that are, freaking out because you're like, we are going to do X?
And absolutely. But a lot of that tone is set by leaders, right?
Yep.
Is by creating the psychological safe space for people to have those conversations, by showing up and modeling, by being clear about this is the direction we're taking, this is why we're taking it, here's our plan, to show up as a leader. And when you show up as a leader, very often that will quiet people who are working for you. It'll quiet their fears or their concerns because maybe they did have an experience before that it didn't go well. And in fact, there's one client that I spoke to about 2 weeks ago where we have this situation with their leadership team that last year they had a leadership session that went really, really badly around the conversation of DE&I. Mm-hmm. And now it's about winning them over again, influencing them, giving them other opportunities to open up again, be vulnerable again, right? Because that's a fearful thing as well, for leaders to be in a group and be vulnerable with each other and learn and be curious. So it's also how, interestingly, I think it's also how we as consultants or we as facilitators show up, not to make people wrong, to always create a space that people feel comfortable to share things that they might, in other instances, be uncertain about sharing, right? So that's our responsibility to make sure that we create the conditions for those conversations.
Wow. So you talked a little bit about, because Kat asked you about this whole issue of bias. When we talk about leaders, just in general, there is this issue of power, though. And can you speak a little bit to, they really wield a lot of power here as we look at whether we're going to change and try to add in the DE&I lens to what we do.
Absolutely. So, and that's exactly what you're saying. When you are in a position of power, the impact that you have to influence other people is very high. And one of the things that I also believe is that power, there's power in proximity. So the closer people are to the power base, right, the more they pick up from that power, and they have power also to influence and to guide and to change. And to drive a company in a certain direction. Very often, still in our current structures in the US, there is privilege that comes along with that power, right, which will impact access. So that's that proximity piece again. And so a lot of it is about shifting or detangling that a little bit so that there is a space that allows for conversations to have around that. And then you can maybe begin to talk about the bias, right? The impact of your preferences inside of this power base and this privilege base. And how do you use the power that you have, the privilege that you have, to impact more positively? And might be, sorry, Karen?
Can you illustrate that for me with maybe an example of handling this whole issue of power, privilege, and bias?
So it may be that as a result of your privilege to be in a certain position in a certain company, and perhaps that's because you were lucky enough to have a great education at a really good school, or you had good networks that people could introduce you to, or maybe it's your gender. There's a variety of things that might feed into that power base, right? It's all a little bit different, but those are the typical ones we would hear about nowadays. That gives you influence off the basis of your privilege and the access that you have. And so when you begin to understand that and how your bias within that can play out, if you are perhaps unaware, so maybe it's unconscious bias, or you are unaware of how you show up in a room, how you show up as a leader, that's where you have to begin to look a little bit more carefully and begin to make some changes, both from a personal and internal perspective, from a team perspective, how your leadership team is working, and then how you show up in the organization. I don't know if that answers your question.
That is so helpful for me, and it makes me think. So I have this position. I'm in the C-suite. I speak up. I do all those things. But I may have this bias as to, well, how come everybody else doesn't speak up? I don't understand that. But is that a good example of that?
Absolutely. So you might be the leader in the room that chooses to have these conversations, and as you say, and may not notice or begins to notice that other people in the room are not speaking up. But if you haven't learned to be empathetic, or you haven't learned to be a really good listener, or to be able to shift perspective around things, it may be a missed opportunity to say, hey, it sounds like I'm the one speaking in the room, and this is my passion or my goal. What does everyone else think? Or where is everyone else in this conversation? And what makes people excited and what makes people uncomfortable?
Because perception is reality at times.
That's so helpful. What, you got something, Kat?
No, I just was thinking about the impact of just perception and the role that plays in bias and the role that plays in alignment and actually trying to initiate change. Because when you're talking about how is everybody seeing what we're about to do, just that perception can be so wildly vast that to align people's perception without discounting their perception, right? Because you can't say that how they look at it is wrong, or that's not really how it is. And breaking through that to at least get to a place of, well, this is all of the things we all individually think, but this is still the direction that we need to go.
And how do we have this conversation going forward? And how does it matter to the business?
Right.
How does it matter to the employees? How does it matter to us as an organization within a community or society, if that's what matters to the organization? And those are the conversations that I think become more rich when it has all those elements of that leadership journey, right? That define, declare, demonstrate. As that becomes more solidified, it becomes easier, I think, to have conversations, because it will link it back to business, it'll link it back to our humanity, and it'll link it back to the culture that we're trying to create at an organization.
Well, I think, well, also the other facet too is not stifling people expressing that over time, maybe the culture needs to change again, or maybe there's a shift, or maybe there's something that, we left out. Because that's the thing too, is you can communicate a culture, everybody I think can understand it and want to move forward, but then things happen where it's like, maybe we got this wrong, or maybe we should look at it this way because, our business imperatives have changed, whatever, that kind of thing. Because you also don't want people to feel like, okay, now we're aligned. This is the only direction that we're going to go. And yes, we all agree with it right now. And nobody should ever speak up on changing it.
I love that you bring that up, Kat, because people believe with DE&I that there's a final destination. They just believe that, okay, if we just do this, then we're going to be where we need to be. And I just think that is one of the things that leaders really need to understand, that it's not some place that you can you can just say, okay, we're about to travel to DE&I land. Everybody get your ticket and we'll be there in 2 days. It's a 24-hour trip. Do you understand what I'm saying here, Hanlie? Do you understand?
I absolutely understand. I want to 100% agree. It is a journey. It is constantly working on. I always say, try and rather work on a small amount of very impactful things and get it right, and then stack on top of that the next thing, and stack on top of that the next thing. So it's sometimes very difficult to influence change when you're trying to do too much. Do less, do it well, let it land well, make sure it has impact, because that's also how you win more hearts, how you win more minds. Where if you're trying to rush.
And I don't understand, and I love this define, declare, and demonstrate. I love that. I'm just going to keep remembering that and saying that over and over again. I don't understand why business leaders look at DE&I differently than other business problems. And what I mean by that is that as if they don't shift and change, Kat, I'm so glad that you brought that up, is that we'll move in a direction as a company, and then we'll be like, oh, the climate has changed, the competition has changed, some variables has changed. So we're going to have to shift, or we're going to have to do a few things. And it seems like even in the DE&I space that we're like, well, we were moving this way, and if this is not the right way to go now, then we shouldn't be doing anything, or something of that nature. So.
Mm. And it's so interesting because this morning I was speaking to a client and realized that sometimes we try to think of D&I as a performance thing, right? We think of it as, well, we're going to perform this thing and then everything's going to be better. So, we managed to get a better feedback culture because we had these processes and everyone's doing really great. And now we're going to do the same thing with DEI. And unfortunately, yes, there are processes, but DEI is a much more complex, messy thing. And you're going to bring all these different strings together all the time, right? And that's part of the influencing. Who do we influence? What kind of conversations do we have? How do we overcome some of the barriers that are naturally going to come up? And how do we keep on having a growth mindset? Because you have to keep on changing and growing and adapting as you go along your journey.
Right. And it feels like, too, DEI, evolves with the world, right? Like we've had past episodes where it's evolved, it's a change, different things become priorities, and society obviously impacted. So not that, your DEI initiative is so reactive that you're only doing something because, you want to seem a certain way, but it's like it's getting with the times.
Absolutely. And it's different in every country.
Yes. Yep.
So, I was working with a French company a little while back, and they have done fantastic work over the last decade with gender parity and really making sure that becomes one of their calling cards, right? That they got the gender piece absolutely right. And now the world has changed. So, many other companies are doing that. Their competition was doing that also. And so they had to make the next shift to say, okay, we have this now. We're really good at this. We're going to keep our pace on this, but we now need to maybe think about culture and origins, or maybe it's time to look at the sexual orientation piece, the LGBTIQ piece. What is the next thing that's important to us as a business to show up in, either as a business case, right? Because these are the kind of clients that we have globally, or this is just the choice that we're making because of the societies that we are in, and we want to show up in those dimensions as a company who succeeded in one of the other dimensions. So even they who do something well had to make a shift and a change.
Wow. Hanlie, as usual, it was so great. It's always great to have you. Thank you for coming back. What I'm going to take away from this is this whole thing that you implore leaders to do when we talk about define, declare, and demonstrate. When you talked about the define part, for me, this whole thing about adding this personal dimension or component to defining is a new thing that I haven't heard before. And that really sticks with me. So I want to say thank you so much. If you don't know, that's Hanlie van Wyk, and she is our new co-host. Okay, I can't do that again.
Okay, Reggie keeps calling everyone that comes on here our new host, because we see a lot of the same faces. And now we've got about 15 hosts. So
I won't do that. But thank you again, Hanlie, for coming. And as you know, that is Catherine Potts.
Yep. And don't forget, everybody, like, share, engage. Let us know what you like. Let us know what you don't like. All the feedback is really helpful.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Becoming Inclusive is presented by the Kaleidoscope Group, your full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion partner serving clients worldwide. Learn more and continue the conversation at kgdiversity.com.